parents didn't notice me, and the golden sister brought a guy. After all that, my fiancée couldn't take it anymore and left me, and then I never thought my family would fall apart the way it did. Growing up, I had this idea that families stick together no matter what. You know, those cheesy family values my parents drilled into me? I guess you could say I was naive. I mean, who isn't when they're a kid, right? But I learned pretty quickly that the people you think you know best can turn out to be strangers. And worse, they can become your enemies. It all started last summer. I'm James, by the way, and I'm the oldest of 3 kids. I'm 26 now, and my younger siblings, Ethan and Chloe, are 22 and 20. We were close growing up. There were the usual sibling squabbles, of course, but nothing major. My parents, William and Amelia, were always supportive, always giving us what they thought we needed: stability, love, and discipline. I used to think we were one of those rare, solid families that everyone envied. I was wrong. The day things started unraveling, I had just come home from work. I'm an architect, so I'm out late sometimes, working on projects or meeting clients. My parents still lived in the family home, a big place just outside of town. Chloe and Ethan had moved back in after college, not able to afford their own places yet, and my fiancée, Olivia, and I were saving up for our own house, so we were staying there temporarily too. It was kind of crowded, but we made it work. Or at least we tried to. My mom and dad were always at each other's throats lately. Every little thing would set them off. My dad would complain about how my mom didn't cook like she used to, and my mom would retaliate by pointing out how my dad barely contributed to the household anymore. It was like they'd forgotten how to be civil. One night, after another one of their shouting matches, I decided to confront my dad about it. I figured it was time someone said something. I thought I could be the peacemaker. It turns out, I was dead wrong about that too. "Dad, can we talk?" I asked as I found him sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. He didn't even look at me. "What's there to talk about, James?" All of this. You and Mom. It's not normal. I mean, you guys have been at each other's throats every single day for weeks. What's going on?" He sighed, rubbing his temples like he always did when he was stressed. "You wouldn't understand, James." "Well, try me." He finally looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just anger or frustration. It was like a mix of resentment and something darker. "You think it's that easy, huh? You think you can just waltz in here and fix everything with a little chat?" I blinked, taken aback. "I'm not trying to fix anything, Dad. I'm just trying to understand." "Well, maybe you should stop trying," he snapped, standing up suddenly, "because you don't know the first thing about what's really going on in this family." Before I could say anything else, he stormed past me and out of the room. I just stood there, confused and frustrated. What did he mean by that? I thought I knew my family pretty well, but clearly, I'd missed something. The next day, I overheard my parents fighting again, but this time it was worse. My dad's voice was louder than usual, and I could hear the edge in his tone. My mom sounded more desperate, almost like she was pleading with him. I crept closer to the door to listen, something I never would have done before. But things had gotten so tense that I felt like I needed to know what was really going on. "I'm done, Amelia," my dad shouted. "I'm done with all of this. You, this house, these kids, everything. You can't just walk away," my mom cried. "This is your family." "That doesn't mean a damn thing to me anymore," he growled. "You've made sure of that." My heart sank as I listened. My dad had always been the strong, silent type, but hearing him say that was like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was he really ready to leave us all behind? I heard something slam against the wall, probably a door or maybe a chair, and I jumped. My dad stormed out of the room, not even noticing me standing there in the hallway. My mom was left behind, sobbing quietly. That night, I tried to talk to her, but she wouldn't say much. She just kept shaking her head, muttering about how things had changed, how she didn't recognize the man she'd married anymore. And honestly, neither did I. But what I didn't know was that things were about to get even worse. Much worse. As the weeks passed, the tension in the house only grew. My dad started coming home later and later, if he came home at all. My mom became more withdrawn, spending most of her time in her room or out in the garden. where she found some semblance of peace among her flowers. But even the garden didn't seem to be enough anymore. Ethan, my younger brother, had always been kind of a hothead. He was the kind of guy who didn't back down from a fight, no matter how small or pointless. And lately, he'd been looking for fights wherever he could find them. Unfortunately, most of the time, he found them with me. It started off with little things. He'd make snide comments about how I never helped out around the house, or how Olivia and I were freeloading off our parents. At first, I let it slide. I figured he was just stressed out, like the rest of us. But one night, he pushed me too far. We were all sitting in the dining room for dinner. Mom, Dad, Ethan, Chloe, Olivia, and me. It was one of the rare nights my dad had actually bothered to show up. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and no one was really talking. Ethan was glaring at me from across the table, and I could feel his anger radiating. I ignored him for as long as I could, but then he said something that made my blood boil. You know, maybe if James wasn't so busy playing house with Olivia here, he'd actually have time to help out for once. I snapped. I couldn't help it. What the hell is your problem, Ethan? My problem, he spat, slamming his fork down on the table. My problem is that you're always acting like you're better than the rest of us, like you've got everything figured out. Newsflash, James, you don't. I stood up, my hands balled into fists. I never said I had everything figured out, but at least I'm trying to hold this family together. What are you doing? Picking fights with me? Is that your idea of helping? Ethan jumped to his feet, knocking his chair over in the process. Don't you dare lecture me about this family. You're not the one who has to live here every day and deal with this crap. I took a step closer, ready to go at it with him right then and there. Maybe if you weren't such a selfish prick, you'd actually see that we're all dealing with this. Before I could say anything else, he lunged at me. He didn't throw a punch, but he shoved me hard, sending me stumbling backward into the wall. That was it. That was the breaking point. I shoved him back, harder than he expected, and he fell into the table, knocking over the plates and glasses. My mom screamed, and Olivia jumped up, trying to get between us. Chloe just sat there, frozen in shock. Stop it, both of you! My mom cried, tears streaming down her face. This isn't helping anything. But we didn't stop. Ethan came at me again, and this time, he threw a punch. I dodged it, but barely, and swung back, landing a solid hit on his jaw. He staggered, but then he came at me again, grabbing my shirt and pulling me down to the ground with him. We rolled around, fists flying, neither of us willing to back down. My dad finally intervened, pulling Ethan off of me and shoving him across the room. He looked down at me, his face full of disgust. Look at you, he muttered. You're both pathetic. Ethan stormed out of the room, his jaw clenched, and I sat there on the floor, panting and bleeding from a cut on my lip. Olivia knelt beside me, trying to help me up, but I couldn't bring myself to move. All I could think about was how everything had fallen apart so quickly. My dad walked out of the room without another word, and my mom just stood there, shaking her head. Chloe finally got up and left too, and soon it was just Olivia and me, sitting in the wreckage of what used to be our family. After that night, everything changed. The house didn't just feel tense, it felt like a war zone. Every time we were all in the same room, it was like walking on thin ice, waiting for the inevitable crack. My relationship with Ethan had never been the same since our fight. It wasn't just about that one moment. The anger we unleashed on each other was years in the making, and neither of us had realized just how deep it ran. We avoided each other as much as possible, but the air between us was thick with resentment. Mom and Dad were barely speaking, and when they did, it was only to exchange cold, sharp words. I could see the cracks in their marriage widening by the day, and I felt helpless to stop it. Every time I tried to talk to either of them, I was met with dismissive comments or bitter accusations. My father, William, had taken to staying out even later, and when he was home, he spent his time locked in his study. My mother, Amelia, threw herself into household chores with a desperate energy that made her look like a ghost of the vibrant woman she used to be. It wasn't just my parents who were falling apart. Chloe, my younger sister, had always been quiet, the peacemaker among us. But after the incident at dinner, something in her changed. She stopped talking to us altogether, retreating into her room for hours on end, her face a constant mask of worry. When I asked her what was wrong, she'd just shake her head and mumble something about needing space. I wanted to help her, to figure out what was going on inside her head, but I didn't know how. I was too consumed by my own problems to notice the storm brewing beneath her calm surface. Olivia, my fiancée, tried to be the mediator, but even she was starting to feel the strain. She was always good at keeping the peace, but this situation was testing her limits. She'd ask me to be more patient with Ethan or to try talking to my mom, but I was too angry, too tired of playing nice. I'd catch her staring at me sometimes with this look of disappointment, like she couldn't believe how far things had deteriorated. And, to be honest, I couldn't believe it either. Then came the day when everything went from bad to worse. It was a Saturday morning, and the house was unusually quiet. Dad had left early, and Ethan was still asleep. Mom was out in the garden, as usual, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping on a cup of coffee, trying to clear my head. Olivia was upstairs, getting ready to go out for a walk. It was one of those rare moments when I actually felt like I could breathe. That's when Chloe came downstairs. I hadn't seen her much over the past few days, so I was surprised when she sat down across from me. There was something off about her, something I couldn't quite place. She looked pale, her eyes dull and sunken. I asked her if she was okay, and she just shrugged, avoiding my gaze. She started fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve, her fingers trembling. I knew something was wrong, but before I could ask, she spoke. What she said hit me like a freight train. I can't stay here anymore. I blinked, trying to process her words. It was so out of the blue, so unexpected. Chloe, the quiet one, the one who always tried to keep things together, was telling me she was leaving. I didn't know what to say, how to respond. Before I could even ask her where she was going or why, she stood up and walked out of the room. I heard the front door open and close, and just like that, she was gone. I sat there in stunned silence, my mind racing. What had just happened? Why had she left? My thoughts spiraled out of control, my stomach churning with worry. I knew things were bad, but I hadn't realized they were bad enough for Chloe to feel like she had to leave. A few hours passed, and Chloe still hadn't returned. I tried calling her, but she didn't pick up. I started to panic, pacing around the house, wondering where she'd gone. Mom noticed my agitation and asked what was wrong. When I told her, she paled, her hands trembling as she gripped the kitchen counter for support. "I'll talk to her," Mom said, her voice shaky. But there was a look in her eyes that told me she was just as lost as I was. Something was going on with Chloe, something none of us had seen coming. That night, Chloe didn't come home. Olivia tried to calm me down, telling me that Chloe just needed some time, that she'd come back when she was ready. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I tried calling Ethan to see if he'd heard from her, but he didn't answer his phone either. It was like both of my siblings had disappeared. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of yelling. I rushed downstairs to find Ethan and my dad in the middle of a heated argument. Ethan's face was red, his fists clenched at his sides, while my dad stood there, looking furious. "You think you can just waltz back in here and act like nothing's happened?" Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse. "You've been gone for days, Dad. Days. And now you show up and pretend like everything's fine?" "I'm still your father," Dad shot back, his voice cold and commanding. "You don't get to talk to me like that." "Father?" Ethan laughed bitterly. "You're a joke. You don't care about any of us. You're just here because you've got nowhere else to go." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. I stepped into the room, trying to defuse the situation, but it was too late. Ethan lunged at my dad, shoving him hard against the wall. My dad stumbled, but before he could regain his balance, Ethan swung at him, landing a punch square on his jaw. It happened so fast, I barely had time to react. My dad, despite his age, wasn't one to back down from a fight. He retaliated, grabbing Ethan by the shirt and slamming him into the dining table. The sound of wood cracking filled the air as the table buckled under the force of the impact. I rushed forward, trying to pull them apart, but they were locked in a brutal struggle, fists flying and curses filling the room. I could feel the rage radiating off of both of them, years of pent-up anger and frustration finally boiling over. Ethan managed to break free and threw another punch, this one catching my dad in the ribs. My dad gasped in pain, but instead of backing down, he grabbed Ethan by the shoulders and shoved him to the ground, pinning him there with his weight. "Enough!" I shouted, my voice hoarse from yelling, but they didn't stop. My dad's face was contorted in anger, and Ethan was snarling like a wild animal, trying to break free from my dad's grip. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to pull my dad off of Ethan. My dad staggered back, breathing heavily, while Ethan scrambled to his feet, wiping blood from his mouth. They stood there, glaring at each other, neither willing to back down. "What the hell is wrong with you two?" I shouted, my voice shaking with anger. "This isn't how we solve things. You're acting like children." But they didn't listen. My dad turned and walked out of the room without a word, leaving Ethan standing there, his chest heaving with anger. I turned to Ethan, my hands clenched into fists. "What the hell was that?" He didn't answer. He just pushed past me, storming out of the house without another word. I was left standing there, feeling like everything was spiraling out of control. Over the next few days, things went from bad to worse. Chloe still hadn't come home, and neither Ethan nor my dad was willing to talk about what had happened. My mom, sensing the tension, kept to herself, spending even more time in the garden, avoiding us all. Olivia tried to be the voice of reason, but even she was starting to get frustrated with how things were going. Then, one evening, Chloe came back, but she wasn't the same. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, like she'd been through something terrible. She didn't say where she'd been, and when I asked her, she just shook her head and said she didn't want to talk about it. I pressed her, trying to get her to open up, but she pushed me away. I could see the fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she tried to avoid my questions. Something had happened to her while she was gone, something that had changed her, but she wouldn't tell me what it was. Chloe's return didn't bring the relief I'd hoped for. If anything, it only added to the tension in the house. My dad was still distant. My mom was even more withdrawn, and Ethan, well, Ethan was a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. And I was caught in the middle of it all, trying to hold everything together, but feeling like I was losing control. One night, after another tense dinner where no one spoke, I heard Ethan and Chloe talking in the living room. Their voices were low, but I could hear the anger in Ethan's tone and the fear in Chloe's. I crept closer, listening through the doorway. "You have to tell them," Ethan was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "You can't just keep this to yourself." "I can't," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't understand." "I do understand," Ethan snapped. "But keeping this a secret isn't going to help anyone. You have to tell them, Chloe. They need to know." "I'm scared," Chloe admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do." There was a long silence, and then I heard Ethan sigh. "I'll help you," he said softly, "but you can't keep running from this. You have to face it." I backed away, my heart pounding. What were they talking about? What secret was Chloe hiding? And why was Ethan involved? After overhearing Ethan and Chloe, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. It wasn't just the constant fighting or the simmering anger that had been bubbling beneath the surface for months. It was the fear in Chloe's voice, the desperation in Ethan's. Whatever they were hiding, it was big, and it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. The house felt like a powder keg, ready to explode at any moment. Conversations were short, tempers were flaring, and everyone seemed on edge. My parents were barely functioning as a couple anymore, and every interaction between Ethan and my dad was tense, like they were daring each other to make the first move in their next fight. Chloe, who had once been the most stable of all of us, was now a shadow of herself, withdrawn and distant, always looking over her shoulder like she was expecting something bad to happen. The morning after I overheard their conversation, I decided I couldn't keep pretending nothing was wrong. I had to confront Ethan to figure out what he and Chloe were keeping from the rest of us. I waited until Olivia left for work and my parents were out of the house. Ethan was in the garage, working on his car, trying to burn off the frustration he hadn't been able to express in words. I could see the tension in his movements, The way he slammed the hood shut, his jaw clenched as he muttered under his breath. I didn't waste any time beating around the bush. I asked him what was going on, what he and Chloe had been talking about. At first, he brushed me off, claiming it was nothing, but I could see the truth in his eyes. He was hiding something, something that scared him. When I pressed him harder, his defenses crumbled. He told me Chloe had gotten involved with someone dangerous. It had started innocently enough, with a guy she met at college. But things had taken a dark turn, and now she was in over her head. Ethan had found out about it a few months ago, but Chloe had sworn him to secrecy, begging him not to tell anyone. She thought she could handle it on her own, but things had gotten worse. The guy had started showing up at the house, lurking around the neighborhood. Ethan had seen him a few times, but Chloe had always convinced him not to confront him. Hearing all of this made my blood run cold. Chloe had always been so level-headed, so cautious. How had she ended up in this mess? And why hadn't she told any of us sooner? Ethan admitted he was scared too. He didn't know how to protect her from this guy, and the last thing he wanted was for my parents to find out and make things even worse. I didn't know what to do with the information. Part of me wanted to march upstairs and confront Chloe, to demand that she tell me everything. But another part of me, the rational part, knew that wouldn't solve anything. Chloe was scared, and forcing her to talk wouldn't help. I needed to think, to come up with a plan. Over the next few days, I kept a close eye on Chloe, trying to gauge how bad things had gotten. She was still avoiding us, spending most of her time in her room or out in the garden with Mom. But there was a tension in her movements, a nervous energy that hadn't been there before. She was jumpy, constantly looking over her shoulder, flinching whenever someone called her name. One night, I heard her on the phone, her voice low and urgent. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but I knew it wasn't good. When she hung up, she paced around her room for a while before slipping out of the house. I followed her, keeping my distance, not wanting her to know I was watching. She walked down the street, glancing over her shoulder every few steps like she was afraid someone was following her. When she reached the park at the end of the block, she stopped and sat on one of the benches, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. After a few minutes, a guy appeared. He was tall, with a lean build and a face that made my stomach churn. Even from a distance, I could feel the darkness radiating off of him. He looked like trouble, like the kind of person who thrived on making other people's lives miserable. Chloe stood up when she saw him, and I could tell from her body language that she was terrified. They spoke for a while, their conversation heated, with Chloe gesturing frantically and the guy looming over her, his voice low and threatening. I wanted to step in, to pull her away from him and demand he leave her alone, but I knew that would only make things worse. So I watched, my fists clenched, feeling powerless as Chloe tried to reason with him. After what felt like an eternity, the guy finally walked away, leaving Chloe standing there, shaking. She stayed on the bench for a while, staring after him, before finally getting up and heading back to the house. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, filled with images of Chloe and that guy, the way he had towered over her, the fear in her eyes. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I had to talk to her, to convince her to let me help. The next morning, I cornered her in the kitchen, my heart pounding as I told her what I had seen. She tried to deny it at first, but I wasn't having it. I told her I knew everything, that Ethan had told me about the guy, that I had seen them together in the park. She broke down, finally admitting the truth. The guy was her ex, someone she had dated briefly in college before realizing he was bad news. But by the time she had tried to break it off, it was too late. He had started stalking her, showing up at her dorm, following her home from class. She had tried to get help, but nothing had worked. When she moved back home, she thought she was safe, but he had found her. I was furious, not just at the guy, but at myself for not noticing sooner. How could I have been so blind? How had I let things get this bad? Chloe begged me not to tell our parents, saying they wouldn't understand. She was right. Mom and Dad were already hanging on by a thread. If they found out about this, it would push them over the edge. But I couldn't let this go. I couldn't just sit back and watch as my sister's life fell apart. I promised Chloe I wouldn't tell our parents, but I made her swear to let me help. She agreed, reluctantly, and we came up with a plan. Ethan would keep an eye on her, making sure the guy didn't come near the house again. And if he did, we would deal with him, together. For a while, it seemed like things were getting better. Chloe was still jumpy, but she wasn't as withdrawn as before. Ethan and I kept a close watch on her, and the guy didn't show up again. It felt like we were finally regaining some control. But, as always, the calm didn't last. One evening, while we were all sitting down to dinner, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and neither was Olivia. My parents were already tense, barely speaking to each other, and Ethan looked like he was ready to explode at any moment. Chloe went pale the moment the bell rang, and I knew immediately who it was. Before I could stop her, she jumped up and ran to the door. I followed, my heart racing, knowing this wasn't going to end well. Sure enough, when she opened the door, there he was. The guy from the park, standing on our doorstep like he owned the place. Chloe tried to push him away, telling him to leave, but he shoved past her, stepping into the house like he had every right to be there. That's when everything erupted. Ethan came barreling out of the dining room, his face red with rage, and before I could stop him, he lunged at the guy, tackling him to the ground. They started fighting right there in the hallway, fists flying, curses spilling from their lips. My parents rushed in, shouting at them to stop, but it was no use. Ethan was too far gone, his anger boiling over, and the guy wasn't backing down either. Chloe was screaming, trying to pull Ethan off of him, but I grabbed her, pulling her back, knowing it was too dangerous to get involved. Olivia stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock, unable to process what was happening. The fight spilled into the living room, furniture crashing to the floor as Ethan and the guy threw punches at each other, their faces twisted with fury. My dad finally stepped in, grabbing Ethan and pulling him off of the guy, but not before Ethan landed one final punch, sending the guy sprawling to the ground. He lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, before finally scrambling to his feet, blood dripping from his nose. He glared at all of us, his eyes burning with hatred, and spat something under his breath before storming out of the house. For a moment, no one moved. The house was silent, save for the sound of heavy breathing and the ticking of the clock on the wall. My parents stood frozen, their faces pale, while Chloe sobbed quietly in the corner. Ethan was still shaking, his fists clenched, ready to go after the guy again if he came back. I didn't know what to do, what to say. The house was a wreck, and so were we. After that night, things changed again. Chloe was more afraid than ever, constantly looking over her shoulder, jumping at every little noise. Ethan was angrier, more on edge, like he was waiting for the next fight. My parents, already distant, were now completely checked out, barely acknowledging each other or us. I felt like I was drowning, caught in the middle of a storm I couldn't control. Every day was a battle, every conversation a potential explosion, and I knew, deep down, that the worst was yet to come. I had always thought that no matter how bad things got, family was something that stayed intact, something that could withstand the worst storms. But I was wrong. After the night the guy barged into our house, after the fight that nearly tore the place apart, everything was different. Chloe was more scared than I had ever seen her, and Ethan had crossed a line I wasn't sure he could ever come back from. My parents, already distant, seemed like they had checked out entirely. There was no coming back from what had happened, and we all knew it. The house felt like a prison after that night. Ethan and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was strained, tense, as if we were walking a tightrope. I couldn't shake the image of him throwing punches at that guy, the way he had lost control, like all the anger he had been holding in for so long had finally exploded. I knew he thought he was protecting Chloe, but there was a darkness in him now, something that frightened me more than I cared to admit. Chloe, for her part, was a shell of the sister I had once known. She barely left her room, and when she did, she would move quietly through the house, her eyes darting around as if she expected him to show up again at any moment. She wouldn't talk to me about what had happened, and I didn't know how to help her. Every time I tried to reach out, she would shut down, retreating further into herself. I hated feeling so helpless, like there was nothing I could do to fix the mess we had all found ourselves in. And then there was Olivia. She had been so patient, so supportive through everything, but I could see the cracks forming between us too. She was tired of living in a house that felt like a war zone, tired of the constant tension and the explosive arguments that seemed to erupt out of nowhere. I didn't blame her, but it still hurt. We were supposed to be planning our future together, building a life, but instead, we were stuck in this nightmare that just kept getting worse. It was early one morning when the final straw broke. Ethan had gone out the night before, and I hadn't seen him since. Chloe was in her room, as usual, and my parents were upstairs, not speaking to each other. I was sitting in the kitchen, drinking my third cup of coffee, trying to wake myself up after another sleepless night, when I heard the front door slam. I jumped, my heart racing. Ethan walked in, his face bruised, his knuckles raw. He looked like he had been in a fight, and from the way he was carrying himself, I could tell he had taken a beating. I stood up, demanding to know what had happened, but he just brushed me off, heading straight for the stairs. I wasn't having it this time. I followed him, determined to get some answers. We ended up in the hallway outside his room, and the moment I pressed him, he exploded. All the anger, all the frustration, everything he had been bottling up came out in a torrent of rage. He shoved me, hard, slamming me into the wall. I barely had time to react before he was on me, his fists flying. It wasn't like the last fight we had. This time, it was different. This time, he wasn't holding back. I fought back, trying to defend myself, but Ethan was like a man possessed. His punches were wild, fueled by something I didn't understand. I could feel the pain radiating through my body with every hit, but I didn't back down. We were brothers, but at that moment, it didn't feel like it. It felt like we were enemies, like all the resentment we had buried over the years had finally come to the surface. We crashed into the hallway table, knocking over a vase, and I could hear Chloe screaming from her room, telling us to stop. But we didn't. We couldn't. It was like all the anger that had been simmering between us for so long had finally reached its boiling point, and there was no turning back. The noise must have brought my parents down, because suddenly they were there too, trying to pull us apart. My dad grabbed Ethan, shoving him back, but Ethan swung at him too. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Ethan had completely lost it. My mom was screaming, trying to calm him down, but it was no use. Ethan wasn't listening to anyone. Olivia came running down the stairs, her face pale with fear. She tried to pull me away, to get me out of the fray, but I couldn't just leave. I couldn't let Ethan tear everything apart. My dad was yelling, my mom was crying, and Chloe was standing in the doorway of her room, her face white as a sheet. It was chaos. Absolute chaos. That's when Ethan snapped. He lunged at my dad again, and this time, he landed a punch square in his chest, sending him staggering back. My dad wasn't a young man anymore, and I could see the pain in his face as he clutched his chest, trying to catch his breath. My mom rushed to his side, but Ethan wasn't done. He was out of control, and nothing anyone said was going to stop him. I couldn't take it anymore. I launched myself at Ethan, tackling him to the ground. We rolled around on the floor, throwing punches, neither of us willing to give an inch. I could feel my body aching, bruises forming where his fists had connected, but I didn't care. I had to stop him. I had to. Finally, after what felt like hours, I managed to pin him down. He was still thrashing beneath me, his face twisted in anger, but I didn't let go. I couldn't let go. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I held him down, waiting for him to tire himself out. When he finally stopped struggling, I let go and staggered to my feet. The house was silent, save for the sound of my mom crying softly in the corner. My dad was leaning against the wall, breathing heavily, and Chloe was still standing in the doorway, her hands covering her mouth in shock. Olivia was standing behind me, her eyes wide with horror at what she had just witnessed. Ethan lay on the floor, staring up at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The damage was done. That was the moment I realized we couldn't keep living like this. We were destroying each other, one fight at a time. There was no fixing what had been broken. Our family was shattered, and no amount of talking or therapy was going to put it back together. I helped my dad to his feet, and for the first time in a long time, he looked at me with something other than disappointment. He looked tired, defeated. My mom wiped her tears, trying to compose herself, but I could see the cracks in her facade. She wasn't the strong, resilient woman she had once been. None of us were the same anymore. Ethan eventually got up, his face a mixture of rage and shame. He didn't say anything to me as he walked past, heading up to his room. Chloe followed him, but she didn't look at me either. I knew she was scared, not just of Ethan, but of what had happened to all of us. Olivia stayed quiet, standing by my side, but I could tell this had changed something between us too. She wasn't used to this kind of violence, this kind of raw, unfiltered anger. It wasn't who she thought I was, and now that she had seen it, I wasn't sure she would ever look at me the same way again. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. But there were no answers. There was no way to explain how things had gotten so bad, how we had gone from a family to this. I thought about Chloe and the fear in her eyes, about Ethan and the anger that had consumed him. I thought about my parents, who had once been the foundation of our family, now crumbling under the weight of their own problems. I thought about Olivia and whether she would still want to marry me after everything she had seen. And I thought about myself, about the person I had become in the midst of all this chaos. The next morning, I woke up to find the house eerily quiet. Ethan was gone. He hadn't said goodbye, hadn't left a note. He had just disappeared. I didn't know where he had gone, and part of me didn't want to know. I was too exhausted to chase after him, too worn out to keep fighting. Chloe stayed in her room, avoiding us all. My parents barely spoke, moving through the house like ghosts, too broken to try and pick up the pieces. Olivia and I had a long conversation that night, one that I had been dreading. She loved me, she said, but she couldn't live like this. She couldn't be part of a family that was constantly tearing itself apart. I understood, even if it hurt. She left a few days later, and I didn't try to stop her. In the end, the house that had once been so full of life, of laughter and love, was now just a shell. We had lost ourselves, lost each other, and there was no going back. The battles we had fought had left scars, deep ones, and no amount of time would ever heal them. I don't know where Ethan is now, or if he ever found peace. Chloe eventually moved out, and my parents finally separated. They still talk sometimes, but it's strained, distant, like they're speaking to strangers. As for me, I'm still here, trying to make sense of it all, trying to rebuild some kind of life out of the wreckage. But it's hard. Harder than I ever imagined it would be. Family is supposed to be forever, but sometimes, the battles we fight with the people we love are the ones that break us the most.